The fire had been out since midnight. No smoke rose from the chimney. No orange light moved behind the frost on the window. By any measure that mattered on the frontier, the cabin should have been as cold as the snow piled against its door. It was not. Inside, in the far corner of a single room, stood something that looked less like a bed and more like a piece of furniture that had wandered in from another country. A wooden box, chest high, with two small doors carved into its front. One door stood open just a crack, enough to let out a thin thread of warm air, and enough to let a father see his son still breathing, still asleep, still alive. He had not slept. He sat on a low stool with his hands wrapped around a cup that had gone cold an hour ago, watching that crack in the wood the way other men watched a fire. By the door, the woodpile told its own story. Not the story of a man who had plenty, the story of a man counting. 7 logs, maybe 8, for a winter that was nowhere close to finished. Word had already started moving between the nearest farms that a man out past the tree line had done something foolish with his boy's bed. Something that did not look like a bed at all. Something closed up like a crate, like a coffin, some said, though never within earshot of the father. What none of them understood yet, and what he had only half understood himself when he first picked up the saw, was that the answer to a winter without enough wood had nothing to do with building a bigger fire. It had to do with never needing one to last the night at all. That idea did not come from him. It came from somewhere much older, carried across an ocean and half a continent, and nearly lost before it reached him at all. What happened inside that wooden box, over the course of one long and uncertain winter, would decide whether his son lived to see spring. And it would decide something else too. Something about what a family is willing to try when the wood runs out, and there is nowhere left to turn but backward, into memory. Before it had a name, before anyone in the valley had a word for it, it was just a strange shape standing where a bed should have been. The cabin belonged to a man named Halvor Ryden, 34 years old, a farmer who had cleared his own land 6 years earlier with a borrowed horse and a debt he was still paying down in the spring. He was not a builder by trade. He was not known for clever ideas. He was known, if he was known for anything beyond his own fence line, for being quiet, for working later than most, and for raising a boy alone since the fever took his wife 2 winters before. The boy was named Eric. He was 7 years old that winter, thin the way boys get thin when a house runs short on food before it runs short on cold, and prone to a cough that worsened every year once the frost set in. That particular night, the one this story opens on, the temperature outside had dropped to somewhere near 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Cold enough to crack water left standing in a bucket. Cold enough that most cabins in the valley kept their stoves fed through every hour of darkness, or paid for it by morning. Halvor's stove had gone cold by midnight. He had let it go cold on purpose. He sat near the wooden box that held his son, close enough to hear the boy's breathing change from the ragged pull of early evening to something slower, steadier, almost ordinary. He reached out once and touched the outer wall of the box. Not the door, just the plain wood siding, and felt nothing remarkable. It was not warm to the touch. It was simply not cold the way the rest of the room was cold. That difference, small as it seemed, was the entire reason he had spent the better part of 2 weeks building something that looked, to anyone passing by, like a piece of furniture built by someone who had lost his mind a little. He did not think of it that way. He thought of it as the only idea he had left. Outside, the wind pushed against the corner of the cabin where the logs met unevenly, the way it had every night that winter, searching for the same gap it always found. Inside, None of that reached the boy. Not yet, at least. Halvor knew better than to call anything finished after one good night. He had learned that already, the hard way, earlier in the process. But for the first time in longer than he wanted to admit, he let himself sit still for a moment without listening for a cough. It was a small thing. In a winter that had taken so much already, it was enough. 3 weeks earlier, none of this had existed. There was no box, no idea. Only a man standing outside his cabin at dusk, counting logs the way another man might count coins he already knew were not enough. Halvor kept a wedding quilt folded at the foot of his own bed, the one Ingrid had stitched the winter before Eric was born. He did not use it. He kept it folded, the way a man keeps something he is not ready to wear out. On the coldest nights, he sometimes unfolded it just enough to lay across Eric's shoulders, then folded it back before the boy woke and asked why. The farm was small, 40 acres of cleared ground, and twice that in timber he had never gotten around to working properly. Since Ingrid's death, most days went the same way. Chores before light. Eric fed and dressed, and, when the cough allowed it, sent to help with what a 7-year-old could manage. Wood split until his hands lost feeling. Supper eaten in near silence, not from sadness exactly, but from the particular quiet of a house with one adult in it instead of 2. That evening, Halvor stood at the edge of the woodpile with a lantern and did the arithmetic he had been avoiding. The stack was smaller than it should have been for late November. A wet summer had slowed the cutting season, and a strained back in September had cost him nearly 2 weeks he could not get back. What remained, by his own rough count, was somewhere between 4 and 5 cords, when a winter like the ones this valley produced usually asked for 6 or 7. He did the second calculation next, the one that mattered more. At the rate the stove was eating wood to keep the cabin livable through the coldest stretch of nights, and with Eric's cough demanding the room stay warmer than Halvor would otherwise have kept it, the supply would not reach March. It might not reach February. He walked back inside and found Eric already coughing in his sleep, a dry, tearing sound that had grown worse over the past 10 days. Worse each time the temperature dropped past a certain point that Halvor had started to recognize, without needing a thermometer to confirm it. He fed the stove more than he wanted to that night, watching the flames instead of resting, doing the same arithmetic over and over in case it changed. It did not change. Something else would have to. The obvious answer, the one every neighbor would have offered without being asked, was more wood. Cut more, buy more, borrow more, trade more. Halvor had already tried most of it. He had traded a morning of labor to a neighbor for half a cord he could not really spare the time to earn. He had gone back into his own timber with a saw that needed sharpening, and come home with less than he had hoped, his back reminding him for 2 days afterward that it was not fully healed. The math kept landing in the same place. There was not enough time left in the season to close the gap by cutting harder. What he had not tried, because it had not occurred to him until that week, was changing the question itself. The thought came to him strangely, while he was mending a hinge on the cabin door, using tools that had belonged first to his own father, and before that, to a grandfather Halvor had never met. His father had come from a part of Norway where winters lasted longer than they did even in this valley, and where wood, in certain regions, had been scarcer still. Halvor remembered, as a boy himself, sleeping in something his father had built into the wall of their old house back east, a kind of enclosed berth with doors that closed most of the way, tucked close to the chimney. He remembered it mostly as an inconvenience, a strange, dark little space he had disliked as a child, preferring to sleep out in the open room like everyone else once he was old enough to argue about it. He had not thought about it in 20 years. But sitting there with the hinge half mended, he found himself remembering something his father had said once, almost as an aside, about why the old people built beds that way. Not because they liked the dark, not because wood was too precious to burn at all, because a body loses very little heat if the space around it is small enough, and the space stays sealed well enough that the person's own warmth does the work the fire would otherwise have to do all night. He had never tested whether that was true. He did not know if it still would be, built badly by a man who was not a carpenter, out of second-hand boards in a cabin 2,000 miles and 30 years from where the idea had started. He only knew that he had 4 cords of wood, a boy whose cough was getting worse, and roughly 4 months of winter left to survive. He mentioned it to Isak Vold 3 days later, mostly because he needed a second saw, and Isak was the only man close enough to borrow one from without losing half a day's walk. Isak was older than Halvor by a good 20 years, a rancher who had outlasted 3 bad winters that had driven other families out of the valley entirely, and a man whose opinion on matters of building and weather was not something the community took lightly. He had built his own barn with his own hands. He had lost cattle to blizzards that came without enough warning, and he had learned, the way people learn out here, mostly by losing things. When Halvor explained what he intended to build, Isak did not laugh, which Halvor had half expected. He simply set down the coffee he'd been handed and studied Halvor for a long moment, the way a man studies someone he respects, but suspects has made an error. "You'd shut him in a box," Isak said, not a question. Halvor explained the doors, the gap he planned to leave, the idea that the boy would not be sealed in completely, only enclosed enough to hold his own warmth close. Isak was not convinced, and he said so plainly. He had seen what happened when a space held too much of a person's own breath overnight, the air turning heavy and wrong, worse in a sick child than in a grown man. He mentioned a cousin, years back, who had nearly lost an infant to a cradle tucked too close to a wall, with no way for bad air to leave. He was not being cruel. He was being exact, the way a man is exact when he has buried more mistakes than he cares to count. "Wood is a problem, you understand," Isak told him. "A boy who can't breathe right is a problem you don't." Halvor did not have a clean answer to that. He only had the memory of his father's voice, half-formed, describing something built the same way, somewhere the winters had been worse and the wood had been scarcer, and people had still survived, generation after generation, sleeping in boxes very much like the one he intended to build. He borrowed the saw anyway. Isak watched him walk back down the frozen track toward his own cabin, and did not call after him, though later, when the story was retold around the valley, several people would remember that he had stood in his doorway a long while before going back inside. For 2 days after borrowing the saw, Halvor did nothing with it. He split his usual quota of firewood, fed Eric, mended what needed mending, and let Isak's words sit with him the way a splinter sits under skin. Not painful exactly, but impossible to ignore. A boy who can't breathe right is a problem you don't understand. He turned that over more than once while working, and each time he came back to the same uncomfortable place. He did not fully understand it either. That was the truth of it. What he understood was smaller and more desperate than any confident plan. He understood a wood pile that would not last. A boy whose cough had started interrupting his sleep 2 or 3 times a night. And a memory, half-formed and second-hand, of something that had apparently worked well enough that his father's family had built it for generations without anyone freezing or suffocating because of it. That was not proof. It was not even close to proof. But it was more than he currently had. On the 3rd morning, he pulled the boards from the old hay shed, the ones left over from a repair job 2 summers back, and began measuring the corner of the cabin where the new bed would stand, close enough to the chimney's warm brick flank to catch some of its residual heat, far enough from the door that drafts wouldn't reach it directly. He built the frame first. Simple joinery. Nothing fancy. Sized to Eric's height, with enough room to grow over the next year or two. Then the sides, solid boards fitted as tightly as his tools and his patience allowed. Eric, when his cough permitted it, sat nearby and handed over nails, watching his father work with the particular fascination boys have for anything being built specifically for them. "Is it a bed or a wagon?" Eric asked at one point, studying the half-finished box with open skepticism. Halvor said it was a bed that knew how to keep its own heat, which was more confidence than he actually felt. By the second evening, the frame stood complete, except for the doors, 2 panels he had not yet decided how to fit. That decision, more than any other part of the build, would determine whether Isaac's warning turned out to be right. He got the doors wrong the first time. Not wrong in a way that was obvious right away, wrong in a way that took most of a night to reveal itself. Wanting to be certain the design would hold in whatever heat it managed to trap, Halvor fitted the 2 panels snugly, closing nearly every gap along their edges. He left only a narrow finger's width of space at the very top, more out of habit than calculation. A small mercy he was glad afterward that he had included it all. Eric went to bed early that night, tired from a day spent mostly indoors, his cough quieter than it had been in almost a week. Halvor tucked the wedding quilt around him inside the box, closed the doors most of the way, and sat down near the stove to wait, telling himself he would check in an hour. An hour became 2. The cabin held its usual chill. The fire banked low the way he had planned it, testing from the first night whether the box alone could do most of the work. When he finally rose to check on his son, something felt off before he even opened the door, a closeness to the air near the box, a faint dampness that had no business being there in a room this cold. He opened the doors and found Eric damp with sweat, his hair stuck to his forehead, his breathing shallow and quick in a way that had nothing to do with his usual cough. The boy stirred, disoriented, coughing harder now, a wetter sound than before. Halvor pulled him out into the open room immediately, wrapping him instead in blankets near the stove, his hands not quite steady. The air inside the box, when he checked it again, felt heavy in a way he had no name for at the time, thick and used, nothing like the still cold of the rest of the cabin. He sat up with Eric the rest of that night, the boy eventually settling into an uneasy sleep against his chest, and understood, with a sinking certainty, that Isak had not been wrong to worry. What he did not yet understand was why. The heat had been there. The heat had, if anything, worked too well. Something else had gone wrong. Something he had not thought to account for at all. He did not touch the box again for 2 full days. Eric recovered from the rough night slowly, his cough worse for a day before settling back to its usual level, and Halvor spent those 2 days doing chores with only half his attention, turning the failure over in his mind the way he had turned over the original idea weeks before. It was Isak, unexpectedly, who gave him the piece he was missing. Halvor rode over to return the saw, prepared for the conversation to go badly, prepared to hear some version of, "I told you so." Instead, Isak listened to the account of that first night without interrupting, then asked a single question. Not whether the box had gotten warm, whether the air inside it had anywhere to go. Halvor admitted it had almost nowhere to go. A finger's width of gap at the very top. Nothing more. Isak explained something then that he had learned decades earlier, second-hand from an old trapper who wintered in shelters far smaller than any cabin, spaces barely larger than a man's own body. Heat was never the danger in a space that small. A person's own body could produce more than enough of it, especially a growing child working through a fever or a cough. The danger was the air itself growing stale, holding on to moisture with nowhere to escape, until the very thing meant to protect a sick child ended up working against his lungs instead. The fix, Isak said, wasn't sealing the box more tightly. It was giving the damp air a way out before it had the chance to settle. Halvor went home with an idea he had not considered on his own. He widened the gap at the top of the doors, then added a second smaller opening low along the back wall, near the chimney's warm brick, reasoning that warm air would rise and pull cooler, fresher air in behind it, the same slow circulation he had seen work in a smokehouse years before, just at a smaller and gentler scale. The second attempt did not announce itself with any particular drama, which was, in its own way, exactly what he had been hoping for. He rebuilt the doors over the better part of a day, cutting the new low opening carefully, testing the swing of both panels until they moved the way he wanted, close enough to hold warmth, loose enough to let it breathe. Eric watched most of this from a chair by the stove, still recovering, occasionally offering opinions about the box that ranged from unhelpful to accidentally useful. That night, Halvor did not sit and wait the way he had before. He checked twice in the first hour, cracking the door just enough to listen and feel, unwilling to trust the design blind a second time. The air near Eric's face, when he checked, was warm without being close. It moved faintly, the way air moves near an open window on a mild day. Nothing like the thick stillness of 2 nights before. Eric slept through most of the night without the wet, ragged coughing that had marked nearly every night that month. He woke once, briefly, and Halvor heard him shift and settle again without needing to be checked on. In the morning, the fire in the stove had burned down to almost nothing. Far less wood spent than the previous week's coldest nights had required. Halvor touched the outer wall of the box the way he had that very first night in the story's opening, and found the same faint, stubborn warmth, present without needing to be forced. He did not call it a success yet. One good night, corrected after one bad one, was not the same as surviving a whole winter, but for the first time since the woodpile arithmetic had failed him weeks before, the numbers in his head had started tentatively to move in a direction he could live with. Over the next 2 weeks, Halvor did something he had never done before in his life. He began keeping count. Not of days, not of chores, but of logs. Every evening, before banking the stove low the way the corrected box now allowed, he set aside the wood he expected to use and watched, night after night, how much less of it he actually needed. The pattern held steadier than he had dared hope. On a night that would once have demanded the stove stay fed until nearly midnight, the box let him bank the fire hours earlier, Eric's own warmth doing the remaining work the way Isak's trapper had once described. The boy's cough, while not gone entirely, grew markedly quieter, fewer of the wet, tearing spells that had worried Halvor most through November. He mentioned none of this to anyone outside his own cabin. Word travels slowly and unevenly on a frontier this thin, and Halvor was not a man inclined to announce a success before he trusted it himself. Isak came by once during those 2 weeks, ostensibly to return a borrowed hatchet, though Halvor suspected the tool had simply been an excuse. He looked at the rebuilt doors a long moment, ran a thumb along the low back opening Halvor had added, and said little beyond a short nod that Halvor understood, from a man like Isak, as something close to approval, what none of them knew yet, not Halvor, not Isak, not the handful of neighbors who had heard second-hand rumors about the strange bed at the Ryden place, was that the 2 weeks of ordinary cold they had just come through were not the real test. The real test was still building somewhere out over the higher ground to the northwest, gathering the kind of weight a valley like this one saw perhaps once every several winters, and it was less than 10 days away. The first sign came from the animals, not the weather. Halvor's one remaining milk cow grew restless 2 mornings before anything visible had changed in the sky, refusing her usual corner of the barn, pacing in a way she rarely did. He noted it, the way a farmer notes most small oddities, and went about his morning chores without giving it much more thought. By the second afternoon, the sky itself had begun to argue otherwise. A high, thin bank of cloud moved in from the northwest with unusual speed, the wind shifting to come from a direction it rarely favored this time of year, carrying a bite that felt different from the valley's usual cold. Isak rode over uninvited that evening, something he had not done all winter, and stood in Halvor's doorway just long enough to say that in nearly 40 years on this land, he had seen this particular pattern of sky and wind precede exactly 3 storms, and none of them had been small. He did not stay to explain further. He had his own stock to see to. Halvor spent the remaining daylight doing what every prepared household on the frontier did before a storm of uncertain size. He brought in extra water, checked the latches on the barn, and moved the woodpile closer to the door than usual, though even after weeks of the box working in his favor, what remained of that pile was still thinner than he liked. Somewhere between 2 and 3 cords, by his best count, and no way now to add to it before whatever was coming arrived. Eric, sensing the shift in his father's mood more than understanding the reasons for it, asked once whether the box would still work if the storm was very bad. Halvor did not have a confident answer. He gave the boy one anyway, because a 7-year-old on the eve of a blizzard needed steadiness more than he needed honesty about the limits of an experiment 2 weeks old. By nightfall, the first snow had begun, fine and dry, the kind that meant the wind behind it had not yet arrived. The wind arrived sometime after midnight, and when it came from a direction the cabin had never been built to fully withstand. Halvor had oriented the box bed's low back vent toward what was, in an ordinary winter, the sheltered side of the chimney, reasoning correctly that most storms in this valley pushed in from the west. This storm did not behave like most storms. Sometime in its second hour, the wind swung hard toward the northeast, funneling directly along the cabin's back wall, finding the small gap Halvor had cut weeks earlier to solve one problem, and turning it, briefly, into a new one. He woke to Eric coughing, sharper and more sudden than the gentle, settled breathing of the past 2 weeks, and to a draft against his own face when he crossed the room that had not been there before. Opening the box, he found the air inside colder than it should have been, the careful balance of warmth and circulation disrupted by wind, now moving through the low vent, instead of drawing gently past it. Eric was shivering, more startled than harmed, but the difference from every other night that month was immediate and unmistakable. Halvor had perhaps 30 seconds to decide, by his own later account of that night, whether to seal the vent completely and risk the same stale, heavy air that had frightened him weeks before, or leave it open and risk the wind undoing everything the box had accomplished. He chose a third option, one neither he nor Isak had discussed. He packed a folded length of burlap loosely into the outer edge of the vent, tight enough to break the direct force of the wind, loose enough that air could still pass through it slowly, rather than pouring straight in. He fed the stove more than he had needed to in 2 weeks, not trusting the box alone against wind, this determined, and sat beside Eric through the rest of that night the way he had on the very first failed attempt, listening for every change in his son's breathing. The wind did not let up until close to dawn. By the time the light came, gray and thin through snow still falling but softer now, the worst of the storm had passed over the valley and moved on toward whatever lay beyond it. Eric was asleep, properly asleep, his breathing slow and even, the burlap-stuffed vent having done exactly what Halvor had hoped through the second half of the night. The fire in the stove had burned lower than Halvor expected, given how much he'd fed it during the roughest hours, and when he finally stepped outside to assess the woodpile, he found it diminished, but not devastated. Enough remained, by his rough count, to see them through whatever the rest of the winter still intended to demand. Isak came by 2 days later, once the roads had cleared enough for a horse to manage them. He did not ask many questions. He looked at the vent, at the burlap still packed loosely into its edge, and asked only how Halvor had thought to do that in the middle of the night with no time to plan it properly. Halvor did not have a clean answer. He said only that he had spent enough nights that winter learning what the box needed that his hands seemed to know before his mind fully caught up. Word of the storm, and of the small, strange bed that had gotten a sick boy through it on a fraction of the wood any other household would have burned, moved through the valley slowly over the following weeks, the way most true things move in a place like this, carried by people who had seen it themselves, rather than by anyone eager to make a story of it. By late winter, 2 other families had built their own versions, adjusted in small ways for their own cabins, their own children, their own particular problems with wind and wood. Halvor never thought of himself as having invented anything. He had only remembered something, imperfectly, and been desperate enough to test it before he could talk himself out of trying. Eric grew up in that valley, and the box bed stayed in the corner of the cabin for years after he outgrew it, repurposed eventually for storage, then for firewood itself, though Halvor could never quite bring himself to be the one to break it apart. The winter had not been defeated by strength, or by luck, or by any dramatic invention built from nothing. It had been outlasted by a design older than anyone in that valley, carried across an ocean in a boy's half-forgotten memory, corrected twice under pressure, and trusted, finally, when there was no wood left to burn instead. It had never really been about the box. It had been about giving the cold fewer places left to reach him. This story is presented for educational and historical storytelling purposes. It is not engineering, construction, or safety advice.